There are many warnings in the Bible that people talk about. Wars, earthquakes, signs in the heavens. But the most important warning Jesus ever gave about the end of the age is often overlooked. In Matthew 24, when his disciples asked what the last days would look like, Jesus did not begin with global conflict or natural disasters. He began with something quieter: deception. Watch out that no one deceives you. Before the world begins to shake, Jesus says confusion will begin to spread. Voices will multiply. Truth will become harder to recognize. And while life continues to look normal on the surface, something deeper will be changing beneath it. In this video, we are going to walk carefully through Matthew 24 and uncover the warning Jesus gave that many people still overlook today. Because the greatest danger of the last days may not be chaos. It may be the quiet drift away from truth, the most ignored warning of Jesus. Matthew 24, explained. There are warnings in Scripture that feel distant, written for ancient people facing ancient problems. And then there are warnings that feel uncomfortably modern. Matthew 24 belongs in the second category. When Jesus described our world, the first time I read Matthew 24 slowly instead of quickly, not skimming the words the way we often do with familiar passages, but sitting with them long enough to feel the weight of what Jesus was actually saying. Because this chapter is different. Most of Jesus' teachings are invitations, parables about mercy, stories about forgiveness, gentle corrections that call people back toward truth. But Matthew 24 feels more like a window into the future. The scene begins quietly enough. Jesus and his disciples are leaving the temple in Jerusalem. The disciples are impressed by what they see: massive stones, towering structures, the kind of architecture that feels permanent. They point it out to him. Look at these buildings. And Jesus responds with something that must have stopped them in their tracks. Do you see all these things? Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. It's a shocking statement. The temple represented stability, national identity, spiritual center. To imagine it gone would have felt unthinkable. Naturally, the disciples ask the question we all would have asked. When will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? That question opens the door to one of the most discussed chapters in the entire Bible. But here's the detail many people overlook. Before Jesus describes wars, disasters, or global turmoil, he begins somewhere else. Watch out that no one deceives you. Not persecution, not catastrophe, deception. Let that sink in. If the greatest danger facing believers in the last days was simply violence or chaos, Jesus could have warned about those things first. But he begins with something quieter and far more dangerous: deception, false voices, misleading confidence. The kind of spiritual confusion that makes people believe they are following truth when they are slowly drifting away from it. And that is where Matthew 24 becomes deeply relevant to the world we are living in today. Because we live in an age overflowing with information. Opinions move faster than reflection. Platforms amplify voices that would have once remained local. Every day brings new predictions, new interpretations, new explanations about what the future holds. But Jesus does not begin his warning by telling believers to analyze the headlines. He tells them to guard their hearts. Many will come in my name and will deceive many. Notice the language carefully. Not outsiders pretending to oppose Christ, people claiming to represent him. That subtle difference matters. Because deception rarely arrives wearing the label false. It arrives sounding familiar, reasonable, persuasive. And over time it reshapes what people believe truth actually is. Another question quietly emerges here. What happens when an entire generation becomes confident in voices that Jesus warned us to test carefully? Matthew 24 is not meant to produce panic. It is meant to produce awareness. Jesus is not predicting chaos simply to alarm his followers. He is preparing them to remain steady when the world becomes increasingly uncertain. And the most overlooked part of his warning is not the dramatic events people tend to focus on. It is the condition of the human heart during those events. Because according to Jesus, the greatest spiritual danger of the last days is not just external turmoil, it is internal confusion. Which is why the next part of his message begins to reveal the deeper themes hidden inside this chapter. Themes that show how deception, fear, and spiritual fatigue can slowly reshape the faith of those who believe they are standing firm. The warning beneath the prophecy. Matthew 24 is often treated like a timeline. People read it looking for clues about when certain events will unfold. But Jesus was not handing his disciples a calendar. He was preparing them for a condition: the slow rise of spiritual confusion. There is something striking about the order of Jesus' warnings in Matthew 24. When people discuss this chapter, they often jump, immediately, to wars, earthquakes, and global upheaval. Those images are dramatic. They capture attention and make it feel as though Jesus was primarily describing catastrophic events. But he begins somewhere much quieter. Watch out that no one deceives you. That sentence sets the tone for everything that follows. Before wars intensify, before nations clash, before the world begins to feel unstable, Jesus warns about something more subtle: deception. Consider why that warning appears first. If the greatest danger in the last days were simply violence or disaster, Jesus could have started there. Instead, he focuses on the way people understand truth. Many will come in my name. Notice what he is saying. These are not voices openly opposing Christ. They are voices claiming to represent him. That difference matters, because deception rarely appears as obvious rebellion. It usually arrives sounding reasonable, familiar, even compassionate. Ideas begin to shift slowly. Interpretations change. Teachings adjust to cultural pressure. And over time, what once felt clear begins to feel negotiable. The shift is rarely dramatic. It is gradual. Another line in the chapter deepens the warning. Many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. The repetition tells us something important. Jesus is not describing a rare moment. He is describing a pattern that grows as history moves forward. Why does deception become easier during unstable times? Because uncertainty makes people search for confident voices. When life feels stable, people have patience. They can examine ideas carefully. They can compare what they hear with what they know to be true. But when the world begins to shake, when news cycles accelerate and crises multiply, people become more willing to trust whoever sounds certain. Confidence begins to replace discernment. And that is where Matthew 24 begins to feel remarkably modern. Our world is saturated with voices. Platforms amplify opinions instantly. Predictions spread faster than reflection. Every global event produces new interpretations about what it means. Some of those voices are sincere, some are careful, others are careless. But Jesus' warning remains steady. Watch carefully. Do not assume that every confident voice speaks truth. The warning then moves from deception to something even more personal. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. This statement reveals the deeper spiritual danger of prolonged instability. Confusion does not only affect beliefs, it affects the heart. When chaos becomes normal, people grow tired. Hope begins to feel fragile. Trust becomes harder to maintain. And over time, the warmth of faith can begin to cool. Conviction softens. Love grows distant. Faith becomes passive rather than alive. This is why Matthew 24 is not simply a prophecy about global events. It is a warning about endurance. Jesus is preparing his followers for a world where spiritual confusion becomes louder and moral clarity becomes harder to maintain. But in the middle of that warning, he offers a sentence that anchors the entire chapter. The one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Notice what he does not say. He does not say the one who predicts every event correctly will be saved. He does not say the one who understands every detail of prophecy will be saved. He says the one who endures. Because the real challenge of the last days is not simply understanding prophecy. It is remaining faithful when everything around you begins to shift. And the deeper symbolic narratives inside Matthew 24 reveal how that shift begins to resemble another moment in biblical history. A time when society continued functioning normally, while something far more significant was quietly unfolding. The days of Noah. The pattern Jesus wanted us to notice. Jesus did not describe the future only through predictions. He described it through patterns. And the most important pattern he referenced in Matthew 24 was not political or military. It was historical. As it was in the days of Noah. There is a moment in Matthew 24 where Jesus suddenly shifts the conversation. Up to this point, he has spoken about deception, conflict, and instability. But then he introduces an image that must have surprised his listeners. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. At first glance, that comparison seems obvious. Many people assume Jesus is referring to judgment, the flood that ultimately came upon the earth. But if you look carefully at his explanation, you notice something unexpected. Jesus does not describe violence or catastrophe. Instead, he describes normal life. People were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. Those are ordinary activities, daily routines, life moving forward the way it always had. The point Jesus is making is subtle but powerful. The danger of Noah's generation was not that they saw the flood coming and ignored it. The danger was that they never imagined it would come at all. Life felt stable, predictable, permanent. People planned weddings, built homes, organized their futures. And while all of that was happening, something far more significant was unfolding quietly in the background. Noah was building an ark. Consider what that must have looked like to the people around him. Year after year, the construction continued. A massive structure, slowly rising in a world that had never seen rain like the flood that would eventually come. To many observers, it probably seemed absurd, unnecessary, even foolish, because the surrounding world felt secure. And that is the deeper pattern Jesus is highlighting. The final moments before great change often look completely ordinary. Societies continue functioning. People pursue their ambitions. Culture moves forward with confidence that tomorrow will resemble today. And then Jesus says something that should make every reader slow down. They knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came. That sentence captures the essence of spiritual blindness. It is not that the signs were entirely absent. Noah himself was living proof that something unusual was happening. But familiarity has a powerful effect on the human mind. When people become accustomed to a world that feels stable, warnings begin to sound unrealistic. Predictions feel exaggerated. And over time, the possibility of disruption simply fades from view. Another question begins to surface here. What if the most dangerous spiritual condition is not rebellion, but normalcy? Because normalcy can create the illusion that everything will continue exactly as it has before. Jesus describes a world where daily life continues, while deeper currents begin shifting beneath the surface. Deception increases. Confusion spreads. Love grows cold. Yet outwardly, life keeps moving forward. People build careers, raise families, celebrate milestones. From the outside, nothing appears dramatically different. But spiritually, something profound is changing. The comparison to Noah reminds us that God's warnings often unfold gradually. They are not always dramatic interruptions that force attention. Sometimes they appear through quiet patterns that only become obvious to those who are watching carefully. That is why Jesus repeatedly emphasizes awareness. Therefore, keep watch. The instruction is not meant to produce anxiety. It is meant to produce clarity. Because the goal of Matthew 24 is not to convince believers that disaster is inevitable. The goal is to prepare them to live wisely, in a world that may not recognize how close it is to profound change. And that preparation moves the conversation from symbolism into something deeply practical. Because if Jesus is warning his followers to remain awake, while the world around them continues moving normally, the question naturally becomes personal. What does it actually look like to stay spiritually alert, in a culture that feels comfortable ignoring the possibility that anything significant is approaching? Living awake in an unaware world. Warnings in Scripture are never given simply to inform us. They are meant to shape the way we live. Matthew 24 is not only about what will happen, it is about how believers are meant to respond while history moves toward that moment. The discipline of staying awake. If you read Matthew 24 carefully, you begin to notice something interesting about Jesus' teaching. He does not spend most of his time explaining the exact sequence of future events. Instead, he repeatedly emphasizes a posture. Stay awake. Therefore, keep watch. Those words appear again and again throughout his message. And they reveal something important about the purpose of prophecy in the first place. Prophecy is not given so believers can predict the future with precision. It is given so they remain spiritually alert in the present. Because throughout history, people have tried to decode every detail of Matthew 24. Entire books have been written, attempting to identify exact timelines and geopolitical alignments. Each generation believes it may finally have solved the puzzle. Yet Jesus seems far less concerned with whether his followers can calculate the moment. He is concerned with whether they remain faithful while waiting. Imagine the disciples hearing these words for the first time. They had asked about the end of the age. They expected specific answers, clear signs, predictable markers. But Jesus redirects their attention to something much more personal. Watch your life. Because the greatest spiritual danger, in uncertain times, is not confusion about events. It is distraction from faithfulness. Jesus illustrates this point through a series of short images. A servant whose master returns unexpectedly. A household continuing its routine while something significant approaches. Ordinary moments suddenly interrupted by an arrival no one predicted. The point behind all these images is the same. Life will continue. People will work, build, celebrate, plan. The world will not appear permanently suspended in crisis. Instead, normal routines will continue, while the larger story of history moves quietly toward its conclusion. And that is exactly why spiritual awareness becomes so important. Another question naturally arises here. What does it actually mean to stay awake spiritually? It does not mean living in constant fear, nor does it mean obsessively scanning every headline for prophetic clues. The alertness Jesus describes is simpler and deeper than that. It means living with steady allegiance. It means allowing faith to shape everyday decisions, rather than becoming something reserved only for moments of crisis. Prayer becomes conversation rather than emergency response. Scripture becomes guidance rather than occasional inspiration. Obedience becomes a pattern rather than a rare act of courage. In other words, staying awake means refusing to let faith drift into the background of life. Because drift is subtle. Rarely does someone wake up one morning and consciously decide to abandon devotion. More often, faith fades gradually as other concerns become louder. Responsibilities multiply. Distractions increase. Cultural pressures reshape what feels reasonable. And slowly, almost without noticing, spiritual attentiveness begins to soften. That is exactly the condition Jesus is warning about. The danger is not only deception from outside voices, it is the quiet loss of vigilance inside the heart, which is why his warning carries a tone of urgency without panic. Be ready. Those words are not meant to frighten his followers. They are meant to remind them that the story of history is moving toward a moment when allegiance to Christ will become unmistakably clear. Until then, believers live in the tension between normal life and eternal awareness. They raise families, build communities, work ordinary jobs. But beneath all of that, there is a steady recognition that this world is not the final chapter of the story, and that awareness reshapes how they live. Because when people truly believe that Christ will return, faith becomes more than an idea. It becomes preparation. Which leads us to the final movement of Matthew 24, where Jesus shifts from warning to invitation, revealing that the purpose of his message is not to overwhelm his followers, but to anchor them in hope strong enough to endure whatever the future may hold. The warning that leads to hope. Matthew 24 is not meant to leave believers unsettled. Jesus does not reveal these things to create fear. He reveals them to create clarity. The quiet strength of endurance. When people first encounter Matthew 24, they often remember the dramatic details. Wars and rumors of wars, nations rising against nations, earthquakes and upheaval. Those images are powerful, and they are meant to capture attention. But if you step back and look at the chapter as a whole, you begin to notice that Jesus is not building toward chaos. He is building toward endurance. Right in the middle of the warnings, he says something that quietly anchors the entire message. The one who stands firm to the end will be saved. That sentence reveals the heart of everything Jesus is teaching. Because the real issue of the last days is not simply what happens in the world. It is what happens in the human heart while those events unfold. Fear has a way of reshaping people. When the future feels uncertain, individuals often search for security in anything that appears stable. Some turn toward political power, others toward wealth, influence, or ideology. But Jesus invites his followers to find stability somewhere else entirely. In him. Imagine the disciples reflecting on this message after hearing it for the first time. They had asked for signs, clear signals that the end of the age was approaching. Instead, Jesus gives them something more valuable than information. He gives them perspective. History will move forward. Turmoil will come and go. Cultures will rise and fall, but the central calling of a believer will remain unchanged. Remain faithful. Remain watchful. Remain anchored in truth. This is why the most important instruction in Matthew 24 is not a prediction. It is an invitation. Keep watch. Those words do not require believers to withdraw from the world. They do not call people to abandon ordinary life or live in constant anticipation of catastrophe. Instead, they describe a quiet kind of awareness, a life where faith remains awake, even while the world around it drifts into distraction. Another question gently surfaces here. What would it look like if more believers lived with that kind of awareness? Imagine a faith that is steady rather than reactive, a faith that does not panic when headlines grow alarming, a faith that does not grow cold when culture shifts, a faith that continues loving, serving, and trusting God even when the future feels uncertain. That is the kind of faith Jesus is calling his followers to cultivate. Not dramatic excitement, enduring commitment. And that commitment changes how believers see the world. Instead of interpreting every event with fear, they begin to see history as part of a much larger story, one that God is guiding toward its ultimate conclusion. The return of Christ is not presented in Matthew 24 as a threat to those who belong to him. It is presented as the fulfillment of a promise, which means the warning Jesus gives is not meant to discourage his followers. It is meant to prepare them. Because when people understand the story they are living in, they begin to live differently. They hold their ambitions more loosely. They treat others with deeper compassion. They invest their time in things that last longer than temporary success. Most importantly, they remain spiritually awake in a world that often prefers to sleep. Matthew 24 is not simply a prophecy about the future. It is a call to live with clarity in the present. And the invitation Jesus leaves us with is surprisingly simple. Stay awake. Stay faithful. Stand firm. because the most ignored warning of Jesus may also be his most hopeful one. History is moving toward a moment when truth will no longer be hidden, and those who remained faithful will discover that their quiet endurance was never unnoticed.